Welcome to our inaugural event for Sacred Cows, a new talk series where we critically look into the evidence for ideas that can often seem as if they're immune from criticism. Our first sacred cow is the theory of a causal link between diversity and company performance, meaning that if a company increases the diversity of its employees, management or board, then it will necessarily perform better. This theory is frequently promoted in the business world and beyond, most notably by the management consultancy McKinsey, which has published numerous studies with titles like Diversity Matters, Diversity Wins, and Diversity Matters Even More. The theory has now achieved the status of an article of faith and can be difficult to question in corporate environments. But is it true? Our speaker this evening, Professor of Finance at London Business School, Alex Edmans, has critically looked into the evidence and has found that it is rife with examples of reverse causation, inappropriate measurements, inadequate controls, cherry-picking of data, and confirmation bias, all with the goal of fitting a predetermined conclusion based on what people want to be true, not what is true. So, enjoy the talk. We would also like to thank the Ian McTaggart programme for its support. Administered by the Free Speech Union, the Ian McTaggart programme was established to foster a culture of open debate, independent thinking, and free expression among young people in the UK, especially students.
So, Will is co-founder of Sacred Cows and co-host tonight, and to be frank, has done most of the work getting this off the ground, so thanks to him. We met at the Post-Liberal Book Club. Now, if you're interested in what that is, I'm not going to talk about it. Come to the pub afterwards, we'll fill you in, it's very exciting stuff. Anyway, we're both passionate about free speech and intellectual debate and such. And it came up in conversation at one point about a group I used to be involved with about 10 years ago called Skeptics in the Pub, based in Bristol. This was a loose federation of speaking groups. So it's more of a sort of a scientific group, and we used to meet in a pub. And it was, we would talk about a wide range of things, telepathy through to government policy, drug policy, So we'd have a speaker would come in, then we'd have a Q&A, then we'd have drinks. And this was great fun until around 2020. That was obviously the time where things like BLM, transgenderism, lockdowns, all these quite big ideas started appearing on the scene, and you would think Skeptics in the Pub would be the perfect forum to debate them, to look at the evidence, to argue for and against, all this kind of stuff. But what actually happened was there was a schism in Skeptics in the Pub, and half of the membership essentially believed that everything was up for debate, everything should be examined, and the other half basically thought certain topics were off limits. So obviously those off-limit things are sacred cows, essentially. That's where this title, Sacred Cows, came from. So the big idea is we want to kind of take that idea, take that thing that we used to have under Skeptics in the Pub, a new name, a new brand, talks by credentialed experts. It's not just people coming along to rant about things. It's evidence-based, non-partisan, and there's an interactive social element. That's the Q&A, going to the pub, making a bit of community networking. But we want to have an explicit mandate to challenge orthodoxy. So to discuss challenging ideas, things that perhaps you feel like you can't talk about in polite company, basically. Obviously, friends and family, there's things off limits, but there's certainly things off limits in the workplace, in other public forums. I'm going to hand over to Will now, who's going to do the other half of the introduction.
Thank you, Jack. So as Jack said, we came up with Sacred Cows. We think this is one of the biggest sacred cows in the corporate world at the moment, and also the world of government, all sorts of things. So we are very excited. Just a brief plug for our next talk is hopefully going to be about the NHS, which is possibly Britain's biggest sacred cow. Should we be proud of the NHS? So keep on our mailing list for that. Bit of admin. The talk's going to last about 40 minutes. Then we're going to have about 20 minutes of questions. Toilets are downstairs if anyone needs to. And if you've bought a book, you can come and collect your book afterwards, which Alex can also sign. If you're foolish enough not to buy a book, you can still buy a book, but it won't be quite as cheap as it would have been before. So come up as well if there's some remaining. Alex has head off afterwards, but the rest of us will be going to the pub at about 8:30, the Enterprise, so please come and join us if you want to chat more. And I think that's it. Enjoy.
Thanks so much, Jack and Will. It's really great to be here, and I think just this idea of having this group where we can challenge thinking, just look at what the evidence says without fear of repercussions is a really great idea, and it's a huge honour for me to address and give the first talk. So this is on a topic, diversity, that I have a strong interest in having a big relationship with company performance. I'm an ethnic minority myself, and also in my positions when I was the editor of one of the main academic journals in Europe, I first appointed the first women onto our board in our 21-year history. So this is something I would like to be true. Some of my research is on the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So my only discussion here is on the strength of the evidence. It's trying not to be swayed by the ideology, my personal beliefs on this topic. But you might wonder, well, why am I even asking this question? Am I seriously asking this question? Has this not already been answered? Right, there are tons and tons of studies by really trustworthy sources. McKinsey, the most revered management consultancy in the world, they said the business case for gender and ethnic diversity in top teams is stronger than ever. They released the first report, Diversity Matters, but dumb people didn't realise what a striking finding this was. So they needed a second one, Delivering Through Diversity. And even that was not compelling enough. They had a third one called Diversity Wins, and this is where the statement is taken from. Okay, you might think, yes, a really revered consultancy, but maybe it doesn't have the same gravitas as a regulator. Like, if a regulator could force you to take action, that is even more powerful. And so we have the Financial Reporting Council, the regulator in the UK. They had a study which had two parts. First, they interviewed some chairs on their views, and then they conducted some analysis. And they interviewed some chairs, and they seemed to buy into the McKinsey findings. So one says there have been enough reports and statistics and evidence-based research to stop talking about it and get on with it. So just increase diversity. The second one is even stronger. I don't want to see any men. I don't care if they're Jesus Christ. I don't want to see them because the only thing that matters is diversity. But because this is sacred cows, let me challenge this. And there is a new study which has found an inconvenient new truth. There's a strong negative relationship between gender diversity and shareholder value. Over the last 20 years, the percentage of women in the FTSE 100 has improved by 26%, whereas in the US, it only improved by 15%. And also, the US stock market has grown hugely, whereas the UK market has only gone up more modestly. So the country, which had the most increase in diversity, had the least increase in shareholder value. And commenting on the findings, the lead researcher said, this is the clearest evidence that diversity destroys shareholder value. If we had gender parity in the UK, this would cost us £2.3 trillion. How would you respond to that study? You would think, this just makes me angry. This study has so many holes in it, you cannot be serious. And indeed, this study I have completely made up to illustrate my point. So there is no such study, and if you saw this, you would correctly highlight there's so many other reasons why the UK could have underperformed the US. It's not due to diversity, it could be due to economic policy, it could be because the US has a stronger tech sector, and maybe it's been a tech bubble, so many other reasons. And so this is the problem of confirmation bias. So what happens when you see some evidence you don't like to be true? It triggers you. I know the word trigger is used in other contexts, but let me use it in the scientific context. It triggers your amygdala. So that is the part of the brain that induces a fight or flight response. It's like being attacked by a tiger. And so this is why we need forums like this, because sometimes if you're to raise a dissenting viewpoint in the workplace,
Online, even on a professional forum like LinkedIn, people respond to you as if they're being attacked by a tiger. They don't want it to be true. And so that was the reason for the writing this book that is in front of you today. And so there are so many ways in which you could have attacked that study because you don't like the findings. But what is so strong about confirmation bias is that when you see something you do like, you turn off your critical thinking faculties. You don't exercise the same, skepticism was the word that Chapman will use. I would use a similar word, discernment. So it's not the same as cynicism, it's not always trying to look for the worst, it's just being healthy, it's being scientific, it's trying to see are things as robust as they can. And so let's just go to some of the claims and see whether they are backed up by the evidence. So when I go back to the Financial Reporting Council study, I mentioned there were two parts. First, there were the views by the chairs, and second, there was the evidence. And in the evidence part, they claimed higher levels of gender diversity are positively correlated by better future financial performance, and they had a measure of financial performance they called the EBITDA margin. That's what they claimed. At the back of the document, you can see their tables where they ran their tests. They ran 90 different tests, so many ways, 6 measures of diversity, 5 different years, and 3 indices. None of them were significant. So they basically lied about the results. Right, they ran 90 tests, not a single one raised a positive result. In the executive summary, they claimed a result. So notice how big an issue this is. This is not a problem of correlation causation. It's not a problem with quibbling with their methodology. Let's give them their methodology was correct. I agree with their measures of diversity. I agree with the time period they looked at. Let's take that as given. The results were not consistent with the claim. But let's go back to confirmation bias. If this is something that you like, do you scrutinise it? No, you want to shout it from the rooftops. And this is what a lot of respectable companies did. So you can have, say, Linklaters, law firm, you should think, would check the evidence. The effort pays benefits in terms of performance. The Institute for Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, the case was given further clout after new research. Minerva Analytics, that's a proxy advisory firm. Boardroom diversity improves financial performance. So this is something which is such a sacred cow that the very study which finds no results can claim something different, and very few people will question it. So let's then go to the McKinsey study. And I actually was somewhat disingenuous when I talked about McKinsey. I talked about 3 studies, but actually they've doubled down. And they now have a 4th study released last November called Diversity Matters Even More, just to try to hammer home the results. And what they're claiming is that results are even stronger than in any of their 3 previous studies. So anybody who's been living under a rock should suddenly get out of this and highlight the benefits of diversity. The business case is the strongest it has ever been since we've been tracking. The most compelling business case yet. The business case for gender diversity has more than doubled over the past decade, so the premium has got even higher. And they've got so much data. We drew on our largest data set spanning 1,265 companies, 23 countries and 6 global regions. This is not something specific to one particular country. It is true across geographies. But there's many problems with what they do. And again, what is so striking is everything I'm going to explain to you here, you don't even need sort of basic A-level statistics. These are things which are common sense. And if anybody was to publish a study on LinkedIn or anywhere else finding the opposite results, people would immediately see the flaws, but they suddenly switch off their critical thinking ability when they see a result that they like. And so here's one flaw. They relate diversity in 2022 to financial performance in a 4-year period preceding diversity. So then how can diversity be causing financial performance if they're measuring diversity after the final financial performance actually happened? It's much more likely that financial performance allows a company to invest in diversity rather than the other way around. Now, They, in a little box, which is aside from the main report, they refer to an analysis, they acknowledge this problem, and they refer to an analysis of synchronous data, but they never actually display the results. So they claim that if you measured the same year and diversity and performance in the same year, you still get the same results. But you can never check that. They never show this to you. Despite having so much data here, they are surprisingly opaque as to the findings. And even if you looked at diversity in 2022 and profits in 2022, you still have the problem. Is it diversity that causes financial performance, or it could be financial performance that causes diversity, even if you look within the same year. Also in the box, they say for an ethnicity, they also rerun the results with this synchronous data, but we limited them to analyses with years that had shown a statistical significance in our baseline scenario. So let's translate that away from statistical jargon into plain English. So they basically cherry-picked the years that were most likely to find significant results. So what they did is they ran this incorrect comparison to begin with to find the years in which there was a greater payoff to diversity, and then once they highlighted the years in which they're most likely to get the results, then they narrowed the analysis with a better methodology to those particular years. Again, this is highly problematic, but all the people citing this study overlooked it, unfortunately. And that's one problem. The second problem is, well, how do you measure financial performance? Because throughout this document, they make claims such as diversity improves financial performance, but they never tell you how they measure financial performance until page 42 of the 52-page study, which is the appendix. So only a nerd like me would bother to read to the end and look at how they were measuring it. And so what they measure was EBIT, which is earnings before interest and tax. That is not a bad measure. That's actually a legitimate measure of profitability, but there's lots of other measures of profitability available which management consultants use. Earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization. That was what the Financial Reporting Council used. Other things like the gross profit margin, the return on equity, the return on assets. I don't need to define these for you, those of you who are not in accounting. All I'm doing is saying there's different ways to measure financial performance. Now, in a prior paper, these two scholars had shown that McKinsey's earlier 3 studies, which looked at EBIT only, were not robust to using any other measure of financial performance. So what that suggested is they might have done what is known as data mining. They ran tons and tons and tons of different tests. None of these ones worked, but because the one with EBIT worked, they only displayed that one result and that one result alone. And this had been highlighted by this paper. And I know McKinsey know about this paper because the authors called up McKinsey to discuss the results of their paper with McKinsey, but they refused to change their methodology in the light of this critique, which is the opposite of diversity in terms of diverse thinking. Right, so the idea here is if there is legitimate critique, then you improve your methodology. This is science, this is how knowledge evolves. And it might be that they think legitimately this critique was wrong, they are using the one best measure of profitability. But given that this critique had been getting some attention, it was written about in the Wall Street Journal, they should have at least acknowledged it and explained their methodology. Instead they're saying we're going to use the same method as our 3 prior studies for consistency, but another way of saying for consistency is we're not going to learn, we're not going to change our methodology, we've always done it that way, so we're going to keep doing it this way. And in fact, none of these measures of profitability are actually good measures. What I would use, and most researchers would use, is total shareholder return. So allow me to nerd out for just half a minute or 1 second. So what is the difference? Total shareholder return is how much the share price goes up. Why might be that different from profitability? Well, let's take some of the most valuable companies in the world, tech companies like Tesla or Apple. Their share price goes up by a huge amount. It's not always backed up by profitability, certainly not in the electric vehicle industry. So why might a company have very high share prices? Because it's forward-looking, they have really good future prospects. Whereas profitability, that is a very short-term measure. And indeed, one of the benefits of diversity is innovation. You're going to be able to get greater ideas, build for the future, so you want a much more long-term measure rather than just short-term profit. This is what nearly every other study would use. This is in fact what McKinsey's other studies typically use, but they don't use it here, potentially because it doesn't give them the result that they want. So that's the second problem. How they're measuring performance is highly dubious. The third problem here is throwing away data. So what do I mean by this? So what they say is increasing diversity from the bottom to the top quartile increases the likelihood of above average profitability by 39%. So again, what does this mean in plain English? Let's say performance is on a scale from 0 to 10. So all they care about is whether you're above average. Are you from 5 to 10 or 0 to 5? That is the only thing that matters to them. So if performance improved from 4.9 to 5.1, that would count as a win. If it improved from 5.1 to 10, that is not a win. If it improved from 0 to 4.9, that is also not a win. But is that what we really care about? Do we just want to be above average? Let's say you saw the London Marathon 10 days ago and you're inspired to run the next London Marathon, and you find a coach who says, with my expensive training plan, I can beat the average finishing time for a male of 4:21 or the average finishing time for a female of 4:47. No, they don't just try to be above average. They will try to say, well, you'll get great performance. If you buy my shoe or follow my training plan, you don't just want to be above average. And indeed, what do McKinsey say themselves? Well, they say our mission is to help our clients make distinctive, lasting, and substantial improvements in performance. We are a great firm, not an above average firm, that attracts, develops, excites, and retains exceptional people. So nearly every study would look at the actual performance. They would look at whether you're 0, 3, 4.9, 5.1, 7, or 10. Not just whether you're in the top half or the bottom half. But if it doesn't work when you use all of that full colour spectrum, let's just make it into above average versus below average and see whether that gives you the results that you want. The fourth and final thing is there's inadequate control. So I've talked about one problem, why correlation might not be causation. It could be financial performance that causes diversity. But there could be many things that affect both. So maybe larger firms can be more diverse because it might be the larger that you are, then there's more seats on the board and it's easier to get a mix of people. And maybe larger firms perform better because they have stronger financial performance. Maybe age, sort of older firms, again, they can bring more people into the senior management team rather than a couple of friends starting a business out of university. And also older firms might perform better. In fact, McKinsey has so many other studies finding so many other things that drive financial performance. They should have control for these things in their study to rule out the fact that the financial performance is due to these alternative suspects rather than diversity. It's a bit like evidence in another setting. What is the main setting in which you hear the word evidence? It's a criminal trial. And so what is evidence? Evidence only counts as evidence if it's consistent with one particular suspect. If the evidence suggests that Tom, Dick, or Harry could have committed the murder, then it's not evidence because it doesn't pinpoint a particular person. And so here, this correlation is not evidence. It's consistent with so many suspects. It could be diversity causes performance, or performance causes diversity, or these things cause both. But just like a police officer who's decided who's guilty and then tries to interpret all the evidence as consistent with their hunch, This is what McKinsey unfortunately did here. They knew the result they wanted to be true, and then they interpreted the evidence in that direction. So when I released a post about this on my blog highlighting the issue, I got some posts back saying, oh, this is great, but why would McKinsey release such a flawed study, right? So they're a company with a great reputation, but maybe this reputation is coming under scrutiny with things like Purdue Pharma, and so why would they want to release something else which might harm their reputation? Well, actually, it's probably not going to harm their reputation, because confirmation bias means that people won't notice their flaws, or will have no incentive to point them out, because as Jack and Will highlighted in the introduction, to point something out like this could be really costly. You could be cancelled on social media. So if I was a white male, I would not have been able to write the blog post that I wrote, even though it was entirely factual. It tried to be constructive, sticking to the evidence, not based on any ideology. And that is a shame, because people should respond to my post based on the actual content, not the colour of my skin. But I'm able to write that because I'm an ethnic minority, and it's pretty sad that I probably would not have been able to highlight the concerns of this if I were a white male. Also, you get famous, because if you're seen as a proponent of diversity, that's great. Maybe this improves their reputation after issues such as the Purdue Pharma scandal. And you can see like asset managers highlighting the value of this McKinsey study. Sorry for those in the back to which this is perhaps really difficult to read, so let me read this out. So this is from Share Action. That's a leading NGO to encourage responsible ownership for shareholders to push companies to do things they think will be better for the world. And the biggest priority topic that investors try to engage with companies to do is actually not climate change, it's not biodiversity, it's not fair pay. The number one is diversity and inclusion. Why? It is because they referenced research suggesting that board diversity brings better financial performance. So this is something which has a lot of impact. It has led to McKinsey becoming famous, improve their reputation, and then maybe they are hired as a consultant in order to improve diversity. So there's reputational benefits to McKinsey, but there's also reputational benefits to the authors. So Vivian Hunt, the senior partner of McKinsey for UK and Ireland, who was the senior author on all 4 studies, she received a damehood for services to women in business. She has now been appointed the chair of the Harvard Council to appoint the new president after Claudine Gay left office for her reputation for diversity. So this has been great for her reputation, a dame, and gets to appoint the president of perhaps the most influential university in the world. And the author team was all women, 6 women, majority ethnic minority. So they didn't actually take their own advice about the benefits of diversity. These might be people who might have had a particular interest in finding the result. But unfortunately, this is not just McKinsey. So this is not anything about McKinsey, who is an extremely respected consulting firm. There are many other reports that they release, which I think are very informative, where they try to just gather statistics rather than claiming any causal effects or what boosts performance. But there's many other talks like this or many studies. So here is a TED talk with a couple of million views, where the title is Want an Innovative Company, Hire More Women. And this was actually by BCG, so another management consultancy. It's a TED at BCG event where TED partnered with BCG, allowing BCG employees to give talks that get onto the main stage TED stage. And actually this talk ended up getting so many complaints that they had to change the title because this title was misleading. So what they looked at was 6 different measures of diversity, other things like age diversity and racial diversity, and they claimed there was a correlation between diversity and innovation. So the measure of innovation was wrong, they had no controls, but I'm not going to repeat that because I've highlighted those problems earlier. But it could have been any of those 6 types of diversity that led to the performance, but they just highlighted gender diversity when it could have been anything, so they had to change it to how diversity makes teams more innovative rather than this initial title. There's a black box study, which has lots and lots of problems of similar type to the one that I highlighted with McKinsey. I also cover this on the blog. Again, it's an all-female author team with very few people with actual expertise in conducting scientific research. So some of you will know, I've heard of this lady. So Francesca Gino is the leading Harvard Business School professor with some impactful research on dishonesty, who's actually under leave because she's been suspended for being allegedly dishonest with her research. So this is the woman who has been accused of faking data. And notice, I am not claiming whether these accusations are correct or not. That's going through a legal process. I don't have any unique insight. But you might think that somebody who has been accused of this might choose to keep her head down. But a bit like McKinsey trying to launder their reputation with Purdue Pharma with these studies, what she said is the following. So, a LinkedIn profile, which is about selling stuff. You can request her services to bring out the best in your team, but let's ignore that. A groundbreaking study examining 15 years of data revealed the striking truth: increasing board diversity boosts a firm's environmental performance. Well, first, how is this groundbreaking? Because haven't we known from all these McKinsey studies that diversity is great, but let's ignore that for a while. And she says, okay, a 10% in female representation leads to a 17% surge. A similar uptick in black directors is also good, so all types of diversity is good. So let's click on the actual study that she looks at, and it's in a paper in Harvard Business Review by Ethan Moon. I think, well, who is this guy, Ethan Moon? So this was an undergraduate student at Dartmouth College. So this was his undergraduate thesis. So it has so many holes in it that, again, I highlight this on my blog, but it's really strange that Harvard Business Review, which should be producing and publishing the best research, will publish an undergraduate thesis. Again, what this highlights is that people will publish things based on the appeal and not the accuracy, hoping that very few people will challenge this. And obviously on Francesca's page, tons and tons of comments just supporting her, saying how all the current controversy about her is not warranted because she's a supporter of really good things like this. One final study, before I'll change tack, is another one which is quoted in Harvard Business Review. It's called How Women Improve Decision Making on Boards. But they don't actually measure decision making on boards, nor do they measure performance of a company, which might be the outcome of decision making. All they do is they ask people, how is the board atmosphere? So that's nothing to do with decision making, and actually the atmosphere might be negatively correlated with decision making, sometimes a more edgy, tense atmosphere where people are willing to speak up and say some shared dissenting viewpoints might lead to better decisions than a friendly culture where everybody agrees. So that is problematic to begin with. So they interviewed people, 36 women and 13 men, so not a representative sample. But how did they find the sample? They looked at personal contacts through our universities and alumni networks, and then we asked initial interviewees to suggest other board members from their networks. That is completely homogenous, right? That is an old boys or old girls club. Like, you're asking people to suggest their friends, and they will probably suggest people who think like them because they would like to have their findings reinforced. And so when they quote statements about how the boardroom culture is different, what do they look at? Well, one of the results has 5 women and no men. Another one, 5 women and no men. Another question is 8 women and no men, and so on. So overall, the study finds female directors claim female directors behave better, which is not too surprising. So if you ask academics, are academics useful in the boardroom? Yes, they would say yes, even if we're completely useless and we have no knowledge of the real world. So you shouldn't ask, if you do the sample selection in a biased way, this is not necessarily going to give a clear answer. And again, the interpretations are opportunistic, like a police officer who decided who's guilty and interprets every piece of evidence to support that guilt, even if some of the interpretations are inconsistent with each other. So here's one statement. I have absolutely, so apparently one woman said, I have absolutely no knowledge in this area, so I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And I thought to myself that not many men would have said something like that. And that's a good point, right? It's really important to admit that you don't know something rather than just speaking. So being a good listener, not saying anything, that is, I think, a good quality in a boardroom. I'm in so many meetings where people won't shut up, they'll say stuff irrespective of expertise. But then there's a next quote later. I have never sat on a board when a woman says nothing, whereas I have sat on boards where men say nothing. But that's the opposite of what you just claimed, right? In this point here, you're claiming that actually saying nothing is often pretty good, and here you're saying nothing is pretty bad. So which is it? You can't just interpret it according to whether you like the findings. So why does this matter? Because some of this might seem uncomfortable if, like me, you would like to believe that diversity should be pursued because it's a good thing. And so some people might argue, well, isn't diversity a good thing? So the ends justify the means. So it doesn't matter if this research is a little bit flimsy, if it encourages boards to be more inclusive, maybe executive search firms to look beyond the old boys club and consider ethnic minorities and women, then that will improve performance. It doesn't matter if the data is a little bit doctored, it achieves something which is good. But it's not clear, because it's unethical. It's a bit like planting evidence. So I believe Lucy Letby's crimes were horrific, but if I was asked to testify in a trial, did Lucy Letby confess to me that she committed those crimes? I would have to say no, because that would not be true, irrespective of what I believe about her guilt, irrespective of whether I think the ends justify the means. You can't do it. It's like planting evidence. The second point is that opponents will call you out. So there might be some smart thinking people who are anti-diversity, unlike me, and who will try to highlight this and use this to ban any type of consideration of any diversity. So actually, when I wrote my blog post about BlackRock, I ran into a BlackRock managing director at a conference, and it was a bit awkward at the start because I was wondering what he was going to say to me, and he said, "Thank you so much for the post that you made criticising our study." Why? Because the way that you criticised it was very constructive, it was based only on the evidence. Had you not done this, somebody else would have done it, and they would have done it in a much more below-the-belt way. So you, by doing this critique, you've probably dissuaded other people from doing other critiques, and I myself, he said, he was an ethnic minority as well, was really disappointed with the BlackRock study. Based on your post, we've actually now changed our internal approval process. Before studies can go out, they have to be reviewed by scientific experts because the reputational damage is high. Also, if you promise that this is something done to improve financial performance, if financial performance doesn't improve, then supporters might become opponents afterwards because you promised this outcome. Even said, I would like diversity because I think it's the right thing to do, not just to make money, then actually that's a different justification, and then you don't need performance to improve afterwards. But here I think this is the really important one, and this is linked to some of my own research on the benefits of diversity, is that you blind yourself to the true drivers of performance. So one of my papers looks at DEI. Well, haven't I just talked about DEI? No, because what does DEI stand for? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, this is often seen as synonymous with demographic diversity, but it's very different. Right, think of diversity itself. That comprises so many different things, right? So there can be diversity of thinking, diversity of background. If we reduce a human being to just their gender and ethnicity, this reduces the humanity of a person to just two criteria. This suggests if you are a white male, you can never add diversity to a company, irrespective of whether you are the first person in your family ever to go to university. In the UK, there's a lot of regional inequality. If you come from the north and have a different accent, already people might be making inferences about you. That is one form of discrimination which is not captured here. What happens if your expertise is in humanities or liberal arts and everybody else is in finance or engineering? So many other forms of diversity, and another reason why these simple diversity studies have gone viral is it makes things easy. It makes things easy for search consultants and investors, they only need to look at gender or ethnicity in order to approve a new director, rather than taking the time to actually understand the person and how they think, and all of these other more important issues. And that's not just diversity, there's also equity and inclusion. Right, so the current approach is what I call add diversity and stir. So just bring in a diverse set of people to the organisation and just let them do their job, when it actually takes a lot of effort to encourage people to speak up, to cultivate a corporate culture that encourages and rewards dissent and different thinking, where people can speak up, they can express different viewpoints. That is what will truly improve the innovation, the productivity of an organisation. So what we try and do in this paper is to measure this holistic aspect of DEI. We find two things. Number one, DEI has no correlation with demographic diversity. So the issues that people are focusing on, trying to mandate, trying to put into quotas, has little bearing on actually true DEI. And why does that matter? We find that true DEI is correlated with future financial performance, not the simple measures of demographic diversity. So by focusing on this, it encourages boards of directors just to look at gender and ethnicity, investors to approve new appointments based on gender and ethnicity, when this is not actually capturing the full humanity of a person. This is problematic. And also, some people argue, well, diversity is a good thing, but is it true that diversity is a good thing? So why not hire the best people? So if you have a 100-metre race and an Asian finishes 4th, should an Asian then be put on the podium to increase the representation because they never win in the 100-metre race? No, because you give the medals to the best people. So this would be something which could be at the expense of a meritocracy. And there might also be some minorities being hired because they're seen as diversity hires, even if they are hired for their inherent merits. So once I was approached to apply for a board position, and they said, we need more non-white faces, which was hugely insulting. They didn't say it's because of your expertise in corporate governance, so even if I ended up being appointed because of my expertise, people might think I'm appointed here to tick the box, and that would be damaging. But let's challenge what I just said, because this is all about challenging. Maybe my analogy of the 100-metre race is not correct, because the 100-metre race measures how you are doing at this point in time. Gold medal is for the fastest runner right now. But maybe what we care about is future potential. So when we hire somebody for a company, we care about how they'll do in the future. When we admit somebody to university, we also care about future potential. So if somebody is a little bit less than another person, maybe if their trajectory is more upward, then they continue to outperform going forwards, and they might be better in the long term. So to me, this is a compelling reason for diversity, to consider somebody's background, because if you look at their background and their trajectory, rather than just their current static level of achievement, then this might be a better predictor of the future. And certainly, aspects of background which are relevant will be gender and ethnicity, because there is discrimination. But I would just say, don't just limit it to gender and ethnicity. There's discrimination of all kinds. Again, what if you're the first person to go to university? What if your parents were in prison? What if you're coming from a different socioeconomic background? And I would want to try to increase the thinking of diversity to a lot of those other issues. What is also surprising is that some of the strongest proponents of diversity don't look at diversity in other cases. So Mark Cuban, he has been a really outspoken advocate, where says sports teams, which are basketball teams, they will not have Asian or Indian players in them. And the whole idea, well, that diversity is important to encourage creativity. You don't have ethnic diversity in most sports teams. What about most music bands? There is little diversity. So let's say the Beatles, or any sort of all-male band, or there's really famous all-female bands, with the exception of a few. Let's say Fleetwood Mac, which had both female and male lead singers and songwriters. Most music bands will be single gender. This is not clearly at the expense of innovation. In films, you have very few Asian or Indian lead actors, other than in stereotypical roles. I don't have a problem with that. Maybe they're just not as good actors as actors of other ethnicity. Maybe it's merit which leads Asians to be underrepresented in all of these areas. I am not calling for representation here. I don't only watch films with Asian male leads, I watch films because I want them to be good. There's this view that we need to reflect the makeup of the population, but why? If I want to watch a film, if I want to watch a sports team, I want this to be really good, it doesn't really matter whether particular people are represented, and so the companies that I want to work for should be successful companies which allow diversity of thinking and great corporate culture, but this idea that we always need to reflect the makeup of the population, we don't see this. In so many other arenas, it seems to be something by which we want to impose on companies, which we don't want to impose anywhere else. And let me end with this one. So, we want to broaden this beyond diversity because I want to look forward to other topics that you might be challenging in this series. One of them is the difference between practitioner and academic research. And I admit here, I'm an academic, so I'm slightly talking my own book, but there is a difference in that practitioner research is often done for marketing. At the back of documents like McKinsey's and BlackRock's, it says this is a marketing communication. So it's not done for scientific inquiry, it's done to find results that people will want to hear. Whereas academic research, it's often to try to find what the truth is. There are often some papers with not the most popular findings, actually some of the leading research showing that diversity might not have a positive effect is by some leading academic women who are just looking at what the data is showing. The idea of imagining the opposite result and seeing how you'd react, I think this is useful. So go back to one of my early slides, that silly made-up study finding that the reason why the UK has performed worse than the US is due to diversity. People would cancel it because they said there's all of these other explanations, it could be different industries, it could be different time periods. Apply that same discernment and skepticism if there is a result that you do like. Think about how you knock it down. Think about, would the authors have actually released the result if it was the opposite? If not, then you wonder whether the authors have actually data mined in order to get the result that they want. So just a huge thank you. It's a big honour for me to kick off what I think will be a really important series. So should I hand it over to you to do the Q&A, or do I do the Q&A myself?
Yeah.